Next rider, Chapter 12. Behind the door. Alex swam slowly forward, completely blind, afraid at any moment he would crack his skull against rock. Despite the dry suit, he was beginning to feel the chill of the water, and knew that he had to find his way out. He had to find his way out soon. His hands brushed against something, but his fingers weren't too numb to tell what it was. He reached out and pulled himself forward. His feet touched the bottom, and it was then that he realized he could see. Somehow, from somewhere, light was seeping in the area beyond the submerged tunnel. Slowly his vision adjusted itself, waving his hand in front of his face. He could just make out his fingers. He was holding on to a wooden beam, a collapsed roof support. He was closing his eyes and opened them again. The darkness had retreated, showing him a crossroads cut into the rock. The meeting place of 3 tunnels. The fourth behind him was the one that was flooded. As vague as the light was, it gave him strength. Using the beam as a makeshift jetty, he clambered onto the rock. At the same time, he became aware of a soft, throbbing sound. He couldn't be sure if it was near or far, but he remembered what he had heard under Block D in front of the metal door, and knew that he had arrived. He stripped off the dry suit. Fortunately, he had kept the water out. The main part of his body was dry, but ice-cold water was dripping out of his hair, down his neck, and his trainers and socks was sodden. When he moved forward, his feet squelched, and he had to take his trainers off and check them out before he could go on. Iron Rider's map was still folded in his pocket, but he no longer had needed any of it. He no longer had any need of it. All he had to do was follow the light. He went straight forward to an intersection, then turned right. The light was so bright now that he could actually make out the colour of the rock. Dark brown hair. The storming was also getting louder, and Alex could feel a rush of warm air streaming down towards him. He moved forward cautiously, wondering what he was about to come to. He turned the corner, and suddenly the rock on both sides gave way to new brick, with metal grills set at intervals just above the level of the floor. The old mine shaft had been converted. It was being used as the outlet for some sort of air conditioning system. The light that had guided Alex was coming out of the grills. He knelt beside the first of these, and looked through into a large white-tiled room, a laboratory with complicated glass and steel equipment laid out over work surfaces. The room was empty. Tentatively, Alex took hold of the grill, but it was firmly secured, bolted into the rock face. The second grill belonged to the same room. It was also screwed on tight. Alex continued up the tunnel to a third grill. This one looked into a storage room filled with the silver boxes that Alex had seen being delivered by a submarine the night before. He took the grill in both hands and pulled it away from the rock easily, and looking closely, he understood why. Iron Rider had been here ahead of him. He had cut through the bolts which had held it in place. Alex set the grill down silently. He felt sad. Iron Rider had found his way through the mine, drawn the map, swam through the submerged tunnel, and opened the grill all on his own. Alex wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as this without his help, and he wished now that he had known his uncle a little better, and perhaps he admired him a little more before he died. Carefully, he began to squeeze through a rectangular hole and lower himself into the room. At the last minute, lying on his stomach with his feet dangling below, He reached for the grill and set it back into place. Provided nobody looked too closely, they wouldn't see anything wrong. He dropped to the ground and landed cat-like on the balls of his feet. The throbbing was louder now, coming from somewhere outside. It would cover any noise he made. He went over to the nearest of the silver boxes and examined it. The atomic clicked open in his hands, but when he looked inside it, it was empty. Whatever had been delivered was already in use. He took the hammers and crossed to the door. It was unlocked. He opened it 1 centimeter at a time. He peered out. The door led onto a wide corridor with an automatic sliding door at each end and a silver handrail running its full length. 1,900 hours. Red shift to assembly line, blue shift to decontamination. The voice rang over a loudspeaker system. Neither male nor female. Emotionless, inhuman. I glanced at his watch. It was already 7 o'clock in the evening. It had taken him longer than he thought to get through the mine. He stole forward. It wasn't exactly a passage that he had found. It was more an observation platform. He reached the rail and looked down. Alex hadn't any idea what he would find behind the metal door, but what he was seeing now was far beyond anything he could have imagined. It was a huge chamber. The walls half naked rock, half polished steel, lined with computer equipment, electronic meters, machines that blinked and flickered with a life of their own. It was staffed by 40 or 50 people, some in white coats, others in overalls, all wearing armbands of different colours. Yellow, red, blue and green. Arc lights beamed down from above. Armed guards stood at each doorway watching the work with blank faces. For this was where the stormbreakers were being assembled. The computers were being slowly carried in a long, continuous line along a conveyor belt, past the various scientists and technicians. The strange thing was that they already looked finished, and of course they had to be. Sal had told him that they were actually being shipped out during the course of that afternoon and night. So what last-minute adjustments was made here in this secret factory? Why was so much of the production line hidden away? Why Alex had seen on his tourist of Sail Enterprises had only been the tip of the iceberg. The main point of the factory was here, on the ground. He looked more closely. He remembered the stormbreaker that he had used. Now he noticed something that he hadn't seen then. A strip of plastic had been drawn back in the casing above each of the screens to reveal a small compartment, cylindrical and about 5 centimeters deep. Computers were passing underneath the bizarre machine. Cantilever levers, wires, and hydraulic arms. Opaque silver test tubes were being fed along a narrow cage, moving forward as if to greet the computers. 1 tube for each computer. There was a meeting point with infinite precision. The tubes were lifted out, brought round, and then dropped into the exposed compartments. After that, the stormbreakers were accelerated forward. A second machine closed and heat sealed the plastic strips. By the time the computers reached the end of the line, where they were packed into red and white Sail Enterprises boxes, the compartments were completely invisible. A movement caught his eye, and Alex looked beyond the assembly line and through a huge window into the chamber next door. 2 men in biohazard suits were walking clumsily together as if in slow motion. They stopped, an alarm began to sound, and suddenly they disappeared in a cloud of white steam. Alex remembered what he had heard. Were they being decontaminated. Both Stormbreakers were based on the round processor. There couldn't be any need for such extreme. And anyway, this was like nothing Alex had ever seen before. If the men were being decontaminated, what were they being decontaminated from? Agent Gregorovich reports to the biocontainment zone. This is a call for Agent Gregorovich. A lean, fair-haired man dressed in black detached himself from the assembly line and walked languidly towards the door. The slid open to receive him. For the second time, Alex found himself looking at a Russian contract killer, Yasen Gregorovich. What was going on? Alex thought back to the submarine and vacuum-sealed boxes. Of course, Yasen had brought the test tubes that were even now being inserted into the computers. The test tubes were some sort of weapon that he was using to sabotage them. No, that wasn't possible. Back in Port Talon, the librarian had told her that Iron Rider had been asking for books about viruses. Decontamination. The biocontainment zone. Understanding came, and with it something cold and solid jabbing into the back of his neck. Alex hadn't even heard the door open behind him, but he slowly stiffened as a voice spoke softly into his ear. Stand up. Keep your hands by your sides. If you make any sudden moves, I'll shoot you in the head. He looked slowly round. A single guard stood behind him, a gun in his hand. It was the sort of thing Alex had seen 1,000 times in films and on television. They were shocked by how different the reality was. The gun was Browning automatic pistol, and one twitch of the guard's finger would send a 9mm bullet shattering through his skull into his brain. The very touch of it made him feel sick. He stood up. The guard was in his 20s, pale-faced and puzzled. Alex had never seen him before, but more importantly, he had never seen Alex. He hadn't expected to come across a boy that might help. Who are you? He asked. What are you doing here? I'm staying with Mr. Sale, Alex said. He said at the gun. Why are you pointing at me? I'm not doing anything wrong. He sounded pathetic. Little boy lost, but it had the desired effect. The guard hesitated, slightly lowering the gun. At the moment, Alex struck. It was another classic karate blow. This time, twisting his body round and driving his elbow into the side of the guard's head, just below his ear. He had almost certainly knocked him out with a single punch, but he couldn't take the chances and followed it through with a knee to the groin. The guard folded up, the pistol falling to the ground quickly. Alex dragged him back away from the railing. He looked down. Nobody had seen what had happened, but the guard would be unconscious for not long. Alex knew he had to get out of there. Not just back up to the ground level, but out of Sale Enterprises itself. He had to contact Miss Jones. He still didn't know how or why, but he knew now that the Stormbreakers had been turned into killing machines. There were less than 17 hours until the launch at the Science Museum. Somehow Alex had to stop it from happening. He ran. The door at the end of the passage slid open, and he found himself covered with white corridors with windowless offices built into what must be yet more shaft of the Dosemary mine. He knew he couldn't go back the way he had come. He was too tired, and even if he could find his way through the mine, he'd never be able to manage to swim a second time. His only chance was the door that had first led him here. It led to a metal staircase that would bring him to Block D, to D Block. There was a telephone in the room. Failing that, he could use a Nintendo DS to transmit a message, but MI6 had to know what he had found out. He reached the end of the corridor, then ducked back as 3 guards appeared, walking together towards a set of double doors. Fortunately, they hadn't seen him. Nobody knew he was there. He was going to be all right. And then the alarm went off. A klaxon barking electronically along the corridors, leaping out from the corners, echoing everywhere. Overhead, a light began to flash red. The guards wheeled round and saw Alex. Unlike the guard on the observation platform, they didn't hesitate. Alex dived head first through the nearest door. They brought up their machine guns and fired. Bullets slammed into the wall beside him and ricocheted along the passageway. Alex landed flat on his stomach and kicked out, slamming the door behind him. He straightened up, found a bolt, and rammed it home. A second later, there was an explosive hammering on the other side, and as the guards fired at the door, it was solid metal. It would hold. He was standing on a gantry leading down to a tangle of pipes and cylinders like the boiler room of the ship. The alarm was as loud here as it had been by the main chamber. It seemed to be coming from everywhere. I leapt down the staircase 3 steps at a time and skidded to a halt, searching for a way out. He had a choice of 3 corridors. Then he heard the rattle of feet and knew that this choice had become 2. He wished that he had thought to pick up the brown automatic. He was alone and unarmed, the only duck in the shooting gallery, with guns everywhere and no way out. Was this what MI6 had trained him for? Even so, 11 days hadn't been enough. He ran on, weaving in and out of the pipes, trying every door he came to. A room with more biohazard suits hanging on hooks. A shower room, another large laboratory with a second door leading out, and in the middle of a glass tank shaped like a barrel and filled with green liquid. Tangles of rubber tubing sprouted out of the tank, trays filled with test tubes all around. The barrel-shaped tank, the trays Alex had seen them before, as vague outlines on his Nintendo. This must have been standing on the other side of the second door. He ran over to it. It was locked from the inside, electronically by the glass identification plate against the wall. He would never be able to open it. He was trapped. Footsteps approached, and he just had the time to hide himself on the floor underneath one of the work surfaces before the first door was thrown open and 2 more guards ran into the laboratory. They took a quick look around without seeing him. "Not here," one of them said. "You'd better go up." One guard walked out of the way he had come. The other went over the second guard and placed his hand on the glass panel. There was a green glow and the door buzzed loudly. The guard threw it open and disappeared. Ash rolled forward as the door swung shut and just managed to get his hand into the crack. He waited a moment, then stood up. He pulled the door open, and as he had hoped, he was looking out into the unfinished passageway where he had been surprised by a lady of old. The guard had already gone on ahead, and slipped out, closing the door behind him, cutting off the sound of klaxon. He made his way up the metal staircase and through a swing door. He was grateful to find himself back in the fresh air. The sun had already set, but across the lawn, the airstrip was ablaze, artificially illuminated by the sort of lights Alex had seen on the football pitches. There were about a dozen lorries parked next to each other. Men were loading them up with heavy square red and white boxes. The cargo plane that Alex had seen when he arrived rumbled down their runway and lurched into the air. Alex knew that he was looking at the end of the assembly line. The red and white boxes were the same ones he had seen in the underground chamber. The soulmate had completed their deadly secret, were being loaded up and delivered. By morning they would be all over the country. Keeping low, he ran past the fountain and across the grass. He thought about making for the main gate, but he knew that was hopeless. The guards would have been alerted. They'd be waiting for him. Nor he would climb the perimeter fence, nor would the razor wire stretched out across to the top. No, his own room seemed the best answer. The telephone was there, and so were his only weapons. The few gadgets that Smith had given him 4 days, or was it 4 years ago? He entered the house through the kitchen, the same way he had left it the night before. It was only 8 o'clock, but the whole place seemed to be deserted. He ran up the staircase and along the corridor to his room on the first floor. Slowly he opened the door. It seemed his luck was holding out. There was nobody there. Without turning on the light, he went inside and snatched up the telephone. The line was dead. Never mind. He found his Nintendo, all 4 cartridges, his yo-yo and zip cream, and crammed them into his pockets. He had already decided not to stay there. It was too dangerous. He would find somewhere to hide out. Then he would use the Nemesis cartridge to contact MI6. He went back to the door and opened it with a shock. He saw Mr. Gwyn standing in the hallway, looking at hideous with the white face, his ginger hair, and a small twisted smile. Alex reacted quickly, striking out with the heel of his right hand. But Mr. Gwyn was quicker. He seemed to shimmer to one side, then his hand shot out, the side of it driving it into Alex's throat. Alex gasped for breath, but no breath came. The butler made an inarticulate sound and lashed out a second time. Alex got an impression that behind the livid scars, he was grinning, enjoying himself. He tried to avoid the blow, but Mr. Gwyn's fist hit him square on the jaw. He was spun into the bedroom, falling backwards. He never even remembered hitting the floor. Chapter 13. The School Bully. They came for Alex the following morning. He spent the night handcuffed to a radiator in a small dark room with a single barred window. It might once have been a coal cellar. When Alex opened his eyes, the grey first light of the morning was just creeping in. He closed them and opened them again. His head was thumping and the side of his face was swollen where Mr. Gwyn had hit him. His arms were twisted behind him. All the tendons in his shoulders were on fire. But worse than all this was a sense of failure. It was 1st of April, the day when the straw breakers would be unleashed, and Alex was helpless. He was the April Fool. It was just before 9 o'clock when the door opened and 2 guards came in with Mr. Gwyn behind them. The handcuffs were unlocked and Alex forced to his feet. Then, with the guard holding him on each side, he was marched out of the room and up a flight of stairs. He was still in Sale's house. The stairs led to the hall with its huge painting of Judgment Day. Alex looked at the figures writhing in agony on the canvas. If he was right, the image would soon be repeated all over Britain, and it would happen in just 3 hours' time. The guards half dragged him through a doorway and into the room with the aquarium. There was a high-backed wooden chair in front of it. Alex was forced to sit down. His hands were clasped behind him, and the guards left. Mr. Gwyn remained. He heard the sound of the feet on the spiral staircase, saw the leather shoes coming down before he saw the man who wore them. Then Herod Sale appeared, dressed in an immaculate pale grey silk suit. Blonde people of MI6 had been suspicious of the molested multimillionaire from the very start. They all thought he had something to hide, but even they had never guessed the truth. He wasn't a friend of Alex's country. He was its worst enemy. 3 questions, Sale snapped. His voice was utterly cold. Who are you? Who sent you here? How do you know? I don't know what you're talking about, Alex said. Sale sighed. If there had been anything comical about him when Alex had first seen him, it had been completely evaporated. His face was bored and businesslike. His eyes were ugly, full of menace. We have a little time, he said. Mr. Gwyn? Mr. Gwyn went over to one of the staircases and took out a knife. Razor sharp with a serrated edge, held it close to his face, his eyes gleaming. I've already told you that Mr. Gwyn used to be an expert with knives, Sale continued. He still is. Tell me what you know, Alex, or he will cause more pain than you can begin to imagine. And don't try to lie to me, please. Just remember what happens to liars, particularly to their tongues. Mr. Gwyn took a step closer, the blade flashed, catching the knife. My name is Alex Ryder, Alex said. Ryder's son? His nephew. Who sent you here? The same people who sent him. There was no point lying. It didn't matter anymore. The stakes had become too high. MI6? They all laughed without any sign of humour. They sent 14-year-old boys to do that dirty work. Not very English. I'd have said not cricket. What? He had adapted an exaggerated English accent. Now he walked forward and sat down behind the desk. And what of my third question, Alex? How much have you found out? Alex tried to look casual to hide the fear he was really feeling. I know enough, he said. Go on. Alex took a breath behind him. The jellyfish drifted past like a poisonous cloud. He could see it out of the corner of his eye. He tugged at the handcuffs, wondering if it was possible to break the chair. There was a sudden flash, and the knife that Mr. Green had been holding was suddenly quivering in the back of the chair, and a hair's breadth from his head. The edge of the blade had actually nicked the skin of his neck. He felt a trickle of blood slide down over his collar. You're keeping us waiting, Horowitz said. All right. When my uncle was here, he got interested in viruses. He asked about them at the local library. I thought he was talking about computer viruses. That was the natural assumption, but I was wrong. I saw what you were doing last night. I heard them talking about the speaker system, decontamination, and biocontainment zones. They were talking about biological warfare. You've got hold of some sort of real virus. It came here in test tubes packed in silver boxes, and you've put them into the storm breakers. I don't know what happens next. I suppose when the computers are turned on, people die. They're in school, so it'll be school children, which means you're not the Saint everyone thinks you are, Mr. Sale. A mass murderer, a bloody price show. I suppose you might say. Edward Sale clapped his hands softly together. You've done very well, Alex, he said. I congratulate you, and I feel you deserve a reward. So I'm going to tell you everything. In a way, it's appropriate that MI6 should have sent me a real English schoolboy, because you see, there's nothing in the world I hate more. Oh yes, his face twisted with anger, and for a moment, I could see the madness alive in his hands. You bloody snobs with your stuck-up school and your sinking English superatory. But I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you all. He stood up and walked over to Alex. I came to this country 4 years ago, he said. I had no money. My family had nothing. Before a freak accident, I would probably have lived and died in Beirut. Better for you if I had. So much better. I was sent here by an American family to be educated. They had friends in North London, and I stayed with them while. I went to the local school. You cannot imagine how I was feeling then. To be in London, which I had always believed to be the heart of civilization. To be such wealth, and to know that I was going to be part of it. I was going to be English to a child born in Lebanese gutter. It was an impossible dream, but I was soon to learn the reality. Sale leaned forward and yanked the knife out of the chair. He tossed it to Mr. Wynne, who caught it and spun it in his hand. For the moment I arrived at the school, I was mocked and bullied because of my size, because of the colour of my skin, because I couldn't speak English well, because I wasn't one of them. They had names for me. Herod Smell, Goat Boy, the Dwarf. And they played tricks on me, drawing pins on my chair, books stolen and defaced. My trousers ripped off of me and hung on the flagpole underneath the Union Jack. Sale shook his head slowly. I had loved that flag when I first came here, he said. But in only weeks, I became to hate it. Lots of people are bullied at school, Alex began, and stopped as Alex backhanded him viciously across the face. I haven't finished, he said. He was breathing heavily, and there was spittle on his lower lip. Alex could see him reliving the past, and once again he was allowing the past to destroy him. There were plenty of bullies in that school, he said, but there was one who was worse than any of them. He was small, smarty chimp of a boy, but his parents were rich, and he had a way with other children. He knew how to talk his way around a politician even then. Oh yes, he could be charming. He could be charming when he wanted to be, when there were teachers around. But the moment their backs were turned, he was on to me. He used to organise the others. Let's get the goat boy. Let's push his head in the toilet. He had 1,000 ideas to make my life miserable, and he never stopped me thinking up more. All the time he goaded me and taunted me, and there was nothing I could do because he was popular, and I was for Regina. Boy grew and do you know who that boy grew up to be? I think you're going to tell me anyway, Alex said. I'm going to tell you, yes. He grew up to be the bloody Prime Minister. So took out a white silk handkerchief and wiped his face. His bald head was gleaming with sweat. All my life I've been treated the same way, he continued. No matter how successful I've become, how much money I've earned, how much money I've made, how many people I've employed, I'm still a joke. I'm still Herod Smell, the goat boy, the Lebanese tramp. For 40 years I've been planning my revenge, and now at last my time has come. Mr. Wynne went over to the wall and pressed the button. Alex half expected a snooker table to rise out on the floor, but instead a panel slid up on every wall to reveal floor to the ceiling television. Screens which immediately flickered into life. On one screen, Alex could see the underground laboratory. On another, the assembly line. On a third, the airstrip with the last of the lorries on its way out. There were CCTV cameras everywhere, and Sale could see every corner of his kingdom without even leaving the room. No wonder Alex had been discovered so easily. The Stormbreakers are armed and ready. And yes, you're right, Alex. Each one contains what you might call a computer virus. But if you like, is my little April Fool's joke, because the virus I'm talking about is a form of smallpox. Of course, Alex, it's been genetically modified to make it faster and stronger. More lethal, a spoonful of stuff would destroy a city. My Stormbreakers hold much more than that. At the moment, it's isolated, quite safe. But this afternoon, there's going to be a bit of a party in the Science Museum. Every school in Britain will be joining in, with school children gathered round their nice, shiny new computers. And at midday, at the stroke of 12, my old friend, the Prime Minister, will make one of his smug, self-serving speeches. Then he'll press a button. He thinks he'll be activating the computers, and in a way he's right. Pressing the button will release the virus, and by midnight tonight there will be no more school children in Britain. The Prime Minister will weep as he remembered the day he first bullied Herod Sale. You're mad, Alex exclaimed. By midnight you'll be in jail. Sale dismissed the thought with a wave of the hand. I think not. By the time anyone realizes what has happened, I'll be gone. Not alone in this, Alex. I have powerful friends who have supported me. Yasen Gogorovich, you have been busy. He seemed surprised that Alex knew the name. Yasen isn't working for the people who had been helping me. Let's not mention any names of even nationalities. You'd be surprised how many countries there are in the world who loathe the English. Most of their Europe just begin with. But anyway, he clapped his hands and went back to his desk. Now you know the truth. I was glad I was able to tell you, Alex. You have no idea how much I loathed you. Even when you were playing that stupid game with me, the snooker, I was thinking how much pleasure it would give me to kill you. You're just like the boys I was at school. Nothing has changed. You haven't changed, Alex said. His teeth were smarting where Sile had hit him. but he'd heard enough. I'm sorry you were bullied at school, he said. But lots of kids get bullied, and they don't turn into nutcases. You're really sad, Mr. Sale, and your plan won't work. I've told MI6 everything I know. They'll be waiting for you at the Science Museum. So will the men in white coats. Sale giggled. Forgive me if I don't believe you, he said. His face was suddenly stern. And perhaps you forget that I warned you about lying to me. The Mr. Gwyn took a step forward, flipping the knife over so that the blade landed in the flat of his hand. I'd like to watch you die, Sale said. Unfortunately, I have a pressing engagement in London. He turned to Mr. Gwyn. You can walk with me to the helicopter, then come back here and kill the boy, okay? Make it slow. Make it painful. We should have kept back some smallpox for him, but I'm sure you'll think of something much more creative. He walked to the door, then stopped and turned to Alex. Goodbye, Alex. It wasn't a pleasure knowing you, but enjoy your death. And remember, you're only going to be the first. The door swung shut, handcuffed to the chair with the jellyfish floating silently behind him. Alex was alone. Chapter 14. Deep Water. Alex gave up trying to break free of the chair. His wrists were bruised and bloody, where a chain had cut into him, and the cuffs was too tight. After 30 minutes, when Mr. Gwyn still hadn't come back, he tried to reach the zit cream that Smithers had given him. He knew he would burn through the handcuffs in seconds, and the worst thing was he could actually feel it when he had put it in the zipped outer pocket of his combat trousers. But although he outstretched, his fingers were only centimeters away. Try as he might, he couldn't reach it. It was enough to drive him mad. He heard the clatter of a helicopter taking off, and knew that Horowitz must be on his way to London. Alex was still reeling from what he had heard. The multi-millionaire was completely insane. What he was planning was beyond belief. A mass murder that would destroy Britain for generations to come. Alex tried to imagine what was about to happen. Tens of thousands of school children would be sitting in their classes, gathered round their new stormbreakers, waiting for the moment. At midday exactly, when the Prime Minister would press his button and bring them online. But instead, there would be a hiss, and a small cloud of deadly smallpox vapor would be released into the crowded room. And minutes later, all over the country, the dying would begin. Alex had to close his mind to the thought it was too horrible, and yet it was going to happen in just a couple of hours' time. He was the only person who could stop it, and here he was, tied down, unable to move. The door opened. Alex twisted around, expecting to see Mr. Gwyn, but it was Lady Evole, who hurried in, closing the door behind her. Her pale, round face seemed to flush, and her eyes behind the glasses were afraid. She came over to him. Alex, what do you want? Alex called away from her as she leaned over him. There was a click, and to her astonishment, his hands came free. She had unlocked the handcuff. He stood up, wondering what was going on. Alex, listen to me, Vole said. The words were tumbling quickly and softly out of her yellow-painted lips. We do not have much time. I'm here to help you. I worked with your uncle, Hail Iron Rider. Alex stared at her in surprise. Yes, I am on the same side as you. Nobody told me. It was better for you not to know. But, Alex was confused. I saw you with the submarine. You knew what Sale was doing. There was nothing I could do. Not then. It's too hard to explain. We do not have time to argue. You want to stop him? No? I need to find a phone. All the phones in the house are coded. You cannot use them, my friend. But I have a mobile in my office. Then let's go there. Nick was suspicious. If Lady Evole had known so much, why hadn't she tried to stop Sale before? On the other hand, she released him, and Mr. Winter would be back any minute. He had no choice but to trust her, follow her out of the room, round the corner, up a flight of stairs, to a landing with a statue of a naked woman, some Greek goddess in the corner. Vole paused for a moment, resting her hands against the statue's arm. What is it? Alex asked. I feel dizzy. You go on. It's the first door on the left. Alex went past her, along the landing. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her press down on the statue's arm. The arm moved, a lever. By the time he knew he had been tricked. It was too late. He yelled as the floor underneath him swung around on a hidden pivot. He tried to stop himself falling, but there was nothing he could do. He crashed onto his back and slid down through the floor and into a black plastic tunnel, which corkscrew. The corkscrew spat him out. He felt briefly through the air and splashed into cold water. For a moment he was blinded, fighting for air. Then he rose to the surface and found himself in a huge glass tank filled with water and rocks. That was when he realized with horror exactly where he was. Wall had deposited him in the tank with the giant jellyfish. Herod Sales, Portuguese man I wore. It was a miracle that he hadn't crashed right into it. He could see it in the far corner of the tank. The dreadful tentacles with their hundreds of stinging cells, twisting and spiraling in the water. There was nothing between him and it. Alex fought back in the panic, forced himself to keep still. He realized that thrashing about in the water would only create a current that would bring the creature over to him. The jellyfish had no eyes. It didn't know he was there. It couldn't attack. But eventually it would reach him. The tank he was in was huge, at least 10 meters deep, or 20 or 30 meters long. The glass rose above the level of the water. Far out of his reach, there was no way he could climb out. Looking down through the water, he could see light. He realized he was looking into the room he had just left. Herod Sales' private office. There was a moment everything was wrong and distorted through the rippling water. And the door opened. 2 figures walked in. And it could barely make them out, but he knew who they were. Fraulein Vole and Mr. Grimm. They stood together in front of the tank. Vole was holding what looked like a mobile phone in her hand. I hope you could hear me, Alex. The giant woman's voice rang out from a speaker somewhere above his head. I am sure you would have seen by now that there is no way out of the tank. You can tread water, maybe for 1 hour, maybe for 2. Others lasted for longer. What is the record, Mr. Green? I am longer. 5.5 hours. Yes, but soon you will get tired, Alex. You'll drown, or perhaps you'll be fast, and you'll drift into the embers of our friend. You see him? No. It is not an ember to be desired. It will kill you. The pain, I think, will be beyond the imagination of a child. It is a pity, Alex Ryder. The MI6 chose to send you here. They will not be seeing you again. The voice clicked off. Alex kicked in the water, keeping his head above the surface. His eyes fixed on the jellyfish. There was another sound. There was another blurred move. Went on the other side of the glass. Mr. Gwyn had left the room and Vole had stayed behind. He wanted to watch him die. Alex looked up. The tank was lit from above by a series of neon strips, but they were too high to reach. Beneath him he heard a click and a soft wiring sound. Almost at once, he became aware that something had changed. The jellyfish was moving. He could see the translucent cone with its dark maneuver tip heading towards him. Underneath the creature, the tentacles slowly danced. He swallowed water and realized he had opened his mouth to cry out. Vole must have turned on the artificial current. That was what was making the jellyfish move. Desperately, he kicked out with his feet, moving away from it, surging through the water on his back. And one tentacle floated up and wrapped itself over his foot. If he hadn't been wearing his trainers, it would have been stung. Could the stinger nails penetrate his clothes? Almost certainly. His trainers were the only protection he had. He reached the back corner of the aquarium and paused there, one hand against the glass. He only knew that what Roll had said was true. If the jellyfish didn't get him, Titus would. He had to fight every second to stay afloat, and sheer terror was sapping his strength. The glass. He pushed against it, wondering if he could break it. Perhaps there was a way. He checked the distance between himself and the jellyfish, took a deep breath and dived down to the bottom of the pool. He could see Lady Vol watching, although she was a blur to him. He would be crystal clear to her. She didn't move, and Alex realized with despair that she expected him to do just this. He swam to the rocks, looked for one, small enough to bring it to the surface, but the rocks were too heavy. He found one about the size of his own head, and it refused to move. Paul hadn't tried to stop him because he knew that all the rocks were set in concrete. Alex was running out of breath. He twisted around and pushed himself up towards the surface, only seeing at the last second the jellyfish had somewhat drifted above him. He screamed, bubbles erupted out of his mouth. The tentacles were right over his head. Alex contorted his body and managed to stay down, flailing madly with his legs to propel himself sideways. His shoulders slammed into the nearest of the rocks. He felt the pain shudder through him, clutching his arm in his hand. He backed into another corner and rose up, gasping for breath as his head broke through the surface of the water. He couldn't break the glass, he couldn't climb out, he couldn't avoid the touch of the jellyfish. Forever. Although he had brought all the gadgets Smithers had given him, none of them could help him. Alex had remembered the cream. He let go of his arm and ran a finger up the side of the aquarium. The tank was a marvel of engineering. Alex had no idea how much pressure the water was exerting on the huge plates of glass, but the whole thing was held together by a framework of iron girders that fitted around the corners of both the inside and outside of the glass. The metal faces held together by rivets. Treading water, he unzipped his pocket and took out the tube, zipped clean for a healthier skin. If Lady Royal could see what he was doing, she would think he had gone mad. The jellyfish was drifting towards the back of the aquarium. Alex waited a few moments and swam forward and dived for a second time. There didn't seem to be very much of the cream, given the thickness of the gears and the size of the tank. Alex remembered the demonstration Smithers had given him, how little he had used. Would the cream even work underwater? There was no point worrying about that now. Alex had the tube against the metal in the corners of the front of the tank and did his best to squeeze a long line of cream along all the way down the length of the metal, using his other hand to rub it in around the rivets. He kicked his feet, propelling himself to the other side. He didn't know how long he would have before the cream took effect. And anyway, Lady Vol was aware that something was wrong. Alex thought that she stood up again and was speaking to her friend, perhaps calling for help. She had used half the tube on one side of the tank. He used the other second half on the other. The jellyfish was hovering above him, the tentacles reaching out as if to grab hold of him and stop him. How long had he been underwater? His heart was pounding. What would happen when the metal broke? He just had time to come up, take one breath before he found out. Even underwater, the cream had burned through the rivets of the inside of the tank. The glass had separated from the girders and was nothing to hold it back. The huge pressure of water had smashed it open like a door caught in the wind. Alex didn't see what would happen. He didn't have time to think. The world spun and he was thrown forward, as helpless as a cork in the waterfall. The next few seconds were a twisting nightmare of rushing water and exploding glass. Alex didn't dare to open his eyes. He felt himself being hurled forward, slammed into something, then sucked back again. He was sure he was broken every bone in his body. Now he was underwater. He struggled to find air. His head broke through the surface, but even so, when he finally opened his mouth, he was amazed he could actually breathe. The front of the tank had blown off, and those sands of liters of water had cascaded into Horowitz sales office. The water had smashed the furniture and blown the windows out. It was still draining away through the floor. Bruised and dazed, Alex stood up, water curling round his ankles. Where was the jellyfish? Had he been lucky that the two of them hadn't become tangled up in sudden eruption of water, but it could still be close. There might still be enough water in cells of it to allow it to reach him. And backed into a corner of the room, his bold whole body taut. Then he saw it. Lady of all had been less fortunate. She had been standing in front of the glass when the riders had broke, and she hadn't been able to get out of the way in time. She was lying on her back, her legs limp and broken. The Portuguese man I wore was all over her. Part of it was sitting on her face, and she seemed to be staring at him through the quivering muscle jelly. Her yellow lips were drawn back in an endless scream. The tentacles were wrapped all around her. Hundreds of stinging cells clinging to her arms and legs and chest. Feeling sick, Alex backed away to the door and staggered out into the corridor. An alarm had gone off, and he only heard it now, as the sound and vision came back to him. The screaming of the sound shook him out of his dazed state. What time was it? Almost 11 o'clock. At least his watch was still working, but he was in Cornwall, at least a 5-hour drive from London. And with the alarm sounding, the armed guards and the razor wire, he now making out of the complex. Find a telephone? No. Roll had probably told the truth when he said they were blocked. And anyway, how could he get in touch with Alan Blunt or Miss Jones at this late stage? They'd already been at the Science Museum. Just 1 hour left. Outside, over the din of the alarm, Alex heard another sound, the sputter and roar of a propeller. He went over to the nearest window and looked out. Sure enough, the cargo plane that had been there when he arrived was preparing to take off. Alex was soaking wet, battered and almost exhausted, but he knew what he had to do. He span round and began to run. Bye-bye. So everyone, that was the end of me reading you. So bye-bye and thanks for listening to this.